On the northeastern edge of Queens, New York, there is a neighborhood that never seems to sleep. Bright red restaurant signs glow late into the night. Street vendors sell steaming dumplings and roasted duck behind glass windows. The sidewalks are crowded with families, students, and workers moving quickly between shops. This place is called Flushing. Over the past few decades, Flushing has quietly transformed into one of the largest Chinese communities outside of Asia. For many immigrants arriving in New York City, this neighborhood becomes their first real sense of home in a new country. Walk through its streets and you'll hear Mandarin and Cantonese almost everywhere. Grocery stores are filled with familiar ingredients from home. Restaurants serve dishes that taste exactly the way they do in Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangzhou. Banks, travel agencies, and small businesses line the blocks, all designed to help new arrivals find their footing in a foreign place. To outsiders, Flushing looks vibrant and full of opportunity. But beneath the busy storefronts lies another reality, one that many immigrants quietly carry with them every single day: uncertainty. Because for thousands of people living here, their future in the United States depends on something incredibly fragile: immigration status. Student visas expire, work permits must be renewed, green card applications can take years, and asylum cases require navigating a legal system that many people barely understand. A single mistake on a form, one missed deadline, or a denied application can mean the difference between building a life in America and being forced to leave it behind. That pressure pushes many immigrants to seek help from one particular group of professionals: immigration lawyers. In communities like Flushing, these lawyers do far more than just file paperwork. They guide people through one of the most stressful periods of their lives. They explain confusing laws. They defend clients in court. And sometimes, they represent what feels like a person's last chance to stay in the country. Among these lawyers, one name was especially well known in the local Chinese community. His name was Li Jingjing. Most of his clients simply called him Jim. For years, Jim had built a reputation as someone who understood the struggles of immigrants better than most. He spoke their language. He understood their fears. And for many people walking into his office, he represented something incredibly important: hope. But immigration law is a world filled with pressure, desperation, and impossible decisions. And sometimes, when people feel like they are running out of options, even a simple legal consultation can turn into something far more dangerous. Because one afternoon, inside a quiet office in Flushing, a meeting between Jim and a young student would end in violence. The student had come to him looking for help. Instead, she would soon become the center of one of the most shocking crimes the community had ever seen. Her name was Zhang Xiaoning, and the story of how these two lives collided would leave investigators and the entire neighborhood searching for answers. For many immigrants living in Flushing, finding the right lawyer can feel like finding a lifeline. When someone's visa is about to expire, when an application has been denied, or when deportation suddenly becomes a possibility, the search for legal help becomes urgent. And over the years, one name appeared again and again in conversations within the Chinese community. That name was Li Jingjing. Most people simply called him Jim. Jim had spent years working as an immigration lawyer in Flushing. His office handled cases that many other attorneys preferred to avoid: complex immigration problems, difficult paperwork, and clients who often arrived carrying far more anxiety than answers. Every day, people walked into his office holding thick folders filled with documents: passports, visa records, school transcripts, letters from employers. Sometimes the papers were neatly organized. Other times they were crumpled and incomplete, collected in panic during the final days before a visa expired. For many clients, Jim was the person they turned to when everything else felt uncertain. He spoke fluent Mandarin and English, which made communication easier for clients who struggled with the language barrier. In immigrant communities, that kind of connection can quickly build trust. Word spread. Friends recommended him to friends. Students shared his name in online chat groups. Families told relatives about the lawyer in Flushing who had helped them navigate the system. Soon, his office saw a steady stream of people searching for solutions. But immigration law is rarely simple, and like many other areas of law, immigration cases often involve complicated personal histories, strict government regulations, and long waiting periods. A single application can take months or even years to resolve. And sometimes, despite all the effort, the answer is still no. Clients don't always accept that reality easily, because for many immigrants, the stakes are incredibly high. Some have already invested their life savings into moving to the United States. Others have families back home depending on them for financial support. And many have built lives, relationships, and dreams they don't want to abandon. That pressure can make immigration law emotionally intense for both the client and the lawyer. But there was one type of case that was especially complicated: asylum. In the United States, asylum is designed to protect people who face persecution in their home countries. To qualify, applicants must show they have experienced or fear serious harm because of their political beliefs, religion, nationality, or other protected reasons. These cases require strong evidence and detailed testimony. Without it, asylum claims are often rejected. For lawyers, asylum cases can be risky and time-consuming. For clients, however, they sometimes represent the last possible chance to stay in the country. And when people feel like they are running out of options, that last chance can become incredibly tempting. Some clients arrive at a lawyer's office hoping that there is a legal strategy they haven't heard about yet, a loophole, a special exception, a path forward that no one else has mentioned. Sometimes, those hopes are realistic. Other times, they are not. But when desperation and uncertainty collide, misunderstandings can grow quickly. And that is exactly the situation that would eventually bring a young international student to Jim's office. Her name was Zhang Xiaoning. At the time, she was just another student trying to figure out how to stay in the United States. She had no criminal history, no record of violence, and no reason for anyone to believe that her name would soon appear in headlines across the country. But within a short period of time, her life and Jim's would become permanently connected by a case that shocked an entire community. Because what began as a simple legal consultation was slowly turning into something far more complicated. And neither of them seemed to realize just how dangerous that situation would eventually become. Long before her name appeared in police reports and news headlines, Zhang Xiaoning was simply another international student trying to build a future far from home. Like thousands of young people every year, she had come to the United States with a dream. For many students from overseas, studying in America represents opportunity, better education, better career prospects, and the possibility of building a life in a country full of possibilities. At first, Xiaoling's life in the United States seemed ordinary. She attended classes, completed assignments, and adjusted to the unfamiliar rhythms of living in a different culture. Like many international students, she spent her days balancing schoolwork, financial pressure, and the constant responsibility of maintaining her visa status. Because for international students, staying in the country isn't just about passing exams. Their legal status depends on strict immigration rules. Student visas come with clear limitations. Students must remain enrolled full-time. They must follow employment restrictions. And perhaps most importantly, their permission to stay in the country is temporary. When their studies end, the clock begins ticking. Some students apply for work visas. Others continue their education. but for many, the reality is much harsher. They may have to leave the United States entirely. For students who have already spent years building a life in the country, that possibility can feel devastating. Friends are here, opportunities are here, and the future they imagine suddenly feels like it's slipping away. As Xiaoling's time in the United States continued, the pressure surrounding her immigration status reportedly began to grow. What had once been a distant concern was slowly becoming a real and urgent problem. Without a new legal pathway, her ability to stay in the country could soon disappear. And when people find themselves facing that kind of uncertainty, they often start searching for advice anywhere they can find it. Friends, online forums, social media groups. In immigrant communities, information travels quickly. Stories circulate about people who managed to stay in the country through unexpected legal strategies. Someone heard about a student who received asylum. Someone else knew a lawyer who handled complicated immigration cases. Whether these stories are accurate or not almost doesn't matter. When people feel desperate, even rumors can begin to sound like real possibilities. At some point during this period, Xiaoling heard about a lawyer in Flushing who had experience helping immigrants with difficult cases. His name was Li Jingjing, the same lawyer who had already helped many others in the community. So she decided to schedule a consultation. At the time, it probably felt like a simple and logical step. She needed legal advice. He was an immigration lawyer. And meetings like this happened every day in offices all across the country. But what neither of them could have predicted was how complicated their professional relationship would eventually become. Because once Xiaoling sat down inside Jim's office and began explaining her situation, the conversation quickly turned toward a possibility that would change everything. A possibility that sounded like a solution, but would later raise serious questions. The topic was asylum, and for Xiaoling, the idea of applying for asylum might have seemed like the opportunity she had been desperately searching for. What she may not have realized was how dangerous that path could become, because asylum cases are not simple. They require detailed stories, strong evidence, and sometimes they push people into situations where truth, desperation, and survival begin to blur together. And in the months that followed, the relationship between the student and the lawyer would slowly move into exactly that kind of gray area. An area where expectations grow, pressure builds, and one misunderstanding can lead to consequences no one ever expected. Consequences that would eventually lead to violence. When Zhang Xiaoling first walked into the office of Li Jingjing, she was searching for something very simple, a way to stay in the United States. Like many immigration consultations, the conversation likely began with questions. What was her current visa status? When would it expire? What options had she already explored? Immigration lawyers ask these questions every day, trying to piece together a client's situation and determine whether any legal path forward exists. Sometimes the answers are straightforward, other times they are far more complicated. And in cases where traditional visa options are limited, lawyers may discuss alternative strategies. One of those strategies is asylum. Asylum is designed to protect people who face persecution in their home countries. Individuals who can prove they have been targeted or fear serious harm because of their political beliefs, religion, nationality, or social group may qualify for protection in the United States. But the requirements are strict. Applicants must provide detailed accounts of their experiences. They must show credible evidence. And their claims are often closely examined by immigration authorities. Without strong documentation or consistent testimony, asylum cases can quickly fall apart. Yet despite these difficulties, asylum still represents a powerful possibility. Because if it is granted, it can allow someone to remain in the United States legally. For someone facing the possibility of losing everything they had built in the country, that possibility can feel incredibly important. According to later reports, discussions between Xiaoning and Jim eventually touched on this option. The idea of pursuing an asylum case began to enter the conversation. At first, it may have sounded like just another legal possibility, something to explore, something to consider. But in situations where clients are already under intense pressure, even the mention of a possible solution can quickly grow into expectation. And expectation can easily turn into belief. For Xiaoning, the thought of applying for asylum may have felt like hope. But the reality of asylum law is far more complicated. To succeed, applicants must describe specific experiences of persecution. Their stories are carefully reviewed. Investigators compare testimony, documents, and timelines. Even small inconsistencies can raise serious doubts. That means asylum cases often depend on extremely detailed narratives. Where events happened, when they happened, who was involved, why the applicant fears returning home. Without those details, a case can collapse. And this is where immigration law sometimes enters a difficult gray area. Because while many asylum cases are based on genuine experiences, the system has also seen situations where people feel pressured to shape their stories in ways that fit legal requirements. For lawyers, this creates ethical boundaries that must be carefully respected. For clients who are desperate to remain in the country, however, those boundaries can sometimes become blurred. And when expectations begin to grow on both sides, misunderstandings can slowly take root. At first, nothing about the relationship between Xiaoning and Jim appeared unusual. He was the lawyer. She was the client. They were discussing a possible legal strategy. But over time, that strategy reportedly became the center of their interactions. Meetings, discussions, plans about how the case might proceed. For Xiaoling, each step may have reinforced the belief that she was moving closer to securing her future in the United States. Applications must pass through complicated legal processes. Delays are common. And as weeks turned into months, the situation between the lawyer and the student began to change. The optimism that may have existed at the beginning slowly started to fade. Questions began to appear. Concerns about progress, concerns about money, concerns about whether the strategy would actually work. What had once felt like a solution was slowly becoming something else. Source of tension. And by the time Xiaoling scheduled another meeting with Jim, the atmosphere between them was no longer as calm as it had been during that first consultation. Something had shifted. What neither of them realized at the time was that the pressure surrounding this case was about to reach a breaking point. Because their final meeting would not end with paperwork or legal advice. Instead, it would end in violence inside the very office where the story had begun. In immigration cases, time can feel like an invisible pressure slowly tightening on everyone involved. For clients, every passing week brings uncertainty. Every unanswered email, every delayed document, every postponed appointment can feel like a sign that something is going wrong. And for someone whose legal status in the country may soon expire, that uncertainty can become overwhelming. For Zhang Xiaoling, the months following her initial meetings with Li Jingjing reportedly became increasingly stressful. At the beginning, there may have been optimism. The idea of pursuing an asylum case offered a possible solution, one that might allow her to remain in the United States and avoid returning home. But as time passed, that sense of hope slowly began to fade. Immigration cases rarely move quickly. Applications require extensive documentation. Personal statements must be prepared. Evidence must be gathered and reviewed. Even after everything is submitted, decisions can take months or even years. For many clients, this waiting period becomes one of the most difficult parts of the process. Because during that time, Their future remains uncertain. It's not hard to imagine how that uncertainty might have affected Xiaoling. Like many international students, she had likely invested years of effort and significant financial resources into building a life in the United States. Walking away from that future was not something she wanted to accept easily. And when people feel like their future is slipping away, emotions can intensify quickly. Frustration, fear, doubt. According to investigators, the relationship between Xiaoling and her lawyer gradually became strained. Questions began to rise about the progress of the case. There were reportedly discussions about legal fees, and there may have been disagreements about what steps should happen next. What had once been a professional relationship between lawyer and client was slowly turning into something far more tense. From the outside, none of this would have appeared unusual. Conflicts between lawyers and clients are not rare, especially in complex immigration cases where expectations are high and outcomes are uncertain. But inside that relationship, the pressure was quietly building. For Jim, this may have been just another difficult case among many others. But for Xiaoling, it may have felt like the single most important problem in her life. To people looking at the same situation but experiencing it in completely different ways. And when those perspectives collide, misunderstandings can grow quickly. By the time Xiaoling requested another meeting with Jim, the atmosphere between them had reportedly changed. This was no longer simply a consultation about paperwork or legal strategy. Something else was hanging in the air. Frustration, possibly anger, perhaps even a sense of betrayal. Exactly what Xiaoling believed about her situation in those final days remains unclear. But investigators later suggested that she may have felt that the legal strategy she had been relying on was no longer going to work. It would have meant that the future she thought she was building in the United States might suddenly disappear. And for someone already under intense stress, that realization can feel unbearable. So she scheduled one more meeting. One more conversation with the lawyer she had trusted to guide her through the system. Perhaps she was looking for answers. Perhaps she was demanding an explanation. Or perhaps she was hoping that there was still some solution left to find. What no one realized at the time was that this final meeting would become the turning point of the entire story. Because when Zhang Xiaoling walked into Jim's office that day, the pressure that had been building for months was about to explode. And within a short period of time, that quiet office in Flushing would become the scene of a violent crime that shocked the entire community. The next chapter of the story would begin with that meeting. A meeting that started like any other, but would end with a man dead on the floor of his own office. On the day of the final meeting, nothing about the scene outside the office building seemed unusual. The streets of Flushing were busy, as always. People hurried between restaurants, grocery stores, and subway entrances. Office workers moved through the sidewalks, absorbed in their daily routines. Inside one of the buildings along those streets was the law office of Li Jingjing. For years, this office had been a place where immigrants came seeking guidance. Clients sat across from Jim's desk, discussing visas, paperwork, and the complicated process of building a legal future in the United States. But on this particular day, the atmosphere inside that office would be very different. Security cameras later captured Zhang Xiaoling entering the building. She walked through the hallway calmly. To anyone who might have seen her at that moment, she appeared completely ordinary, just another client arriving for an appointment with a lawyer. There was no obvious sign of what was about to happen. Inside the office, the meeting began. At first, it likely sounded like many other consultations Jim had conducted before. Questions, explanations, discussion about the case. But according to investigators, the tone of the conversation soon began to change. What started as a legal discussion gradually turned into an argument. Exactly what was said inside that room may never be fully known. There were no cameras recording the conversation, no witnesses sitting nearby, only the two of them. But something during that exchange caused the situation to escalate. Perhaps it was frustration. Perhaps it was anger. Perhaps it was the realization that the legal path Xiaoling had been hoping for was no longer possible. Whatever the trigger was, the confrontation suddenly took a violent turn. At some point during the argument, Xiaoling reportedly pulled out a knife. Moments later, the quiet law office became the scene of a brutal attack. Investigators later determined that Jim had been stabbed multiple times. The violence happened quickly. Within minutes, the respected immigration lawyer who had helped so many members of the community was lying fatally wounded inside his own office. For years, clients had walked through that door searching for hope. Now the room had become a crime scene. What happened immediately afterward only deepened the shock surrounding the case. Instead of panicking or calling for help, Xiaoling left the office. Security cameras recorded her walking out of the building. She did not run. She did not appear frantic. She simply walked away. To anyone watching the footage later, the calmness of those moments would become one of the most disturbing details of the entire case. Inside the office, however, the consequences of the attack were becoming clear. At some point after the incident, the situation was discovered, and authorities were alerted. When police arrived and began piecing together what had happened, the case quickly took shape. The victim was a well-known immigration lawyer in the community. The suspect was one of his own clients. And the meeting that had brought them together that day was supposed to be a simple legal consultation. Instead, it had ended in tragedy. As investigators reviewed surveillance footage and gathered evidence, it did not take long for them to identify the person responsible. The woman seen entering and leaving the building that day was Zhang Xiaoning. But even as the investigation moved forward, one question remained at the center of the case. How could a dispute between a lawyer and his client escalate into such a violent act? The answer, investigators believed, might lie in the months of pressure, expectations, and misunderstandings that had been building long before that final meeting ever took place. And as the story spread through the Flushing community, the shock only continued to grow. Because for many people, this crime was almost impossible to understand. A young student, a trusted lawyer, a quiet office, and a meeting that ended in murder. When news of the attack began to spread, shock moved quickly through the community in Flushing. For many residents, the victim was not just another name in a police report. Li Jingjing had been a familiar figure in the neighborhood for years. His office had helped countless immigrants navigate the confusing and often intimidating world of immigration law. Clients remembered sitting across from his desk, discussing their futures. Families remembered the relief of finally understanding their legal options. So when people heard that he had been killed inside his own office, the reaction was immediate disbelief. How could something like this happen in the middle of a busy neighborhood filled with businesses and offices? As investigators began their work, the case quickly centered on one person. Surveillance footage from the building showed a young woman entering the office shortly before the attack. Later, cameras captured the same woman calmly leaving the building. Police soon identified her as Zhang Xiaoling, the same student who had previously been meeting with Jim about her immigration situation. Once her identity was confirmed, authorities moved quickly. Within a short time, Xiaoling was located and taken into custody. For investigators, the basic timeline of events was not difficult to establish. The two had met in the office. An argument had taken place. And at some point during that confrontation, the violence occurred. But understanding why it happened was far more complicated. As detectives examined the relationship between the lawyer and his client, they began piecing together the months leading up to the attack. They reviewed communications. They looked into the immigration case that had brought the two together, and they attempted to understand the emotional pressure that may have been building behind the scenes. Immigration disputes are not uncommon. Lawyers and clients sometimes disagree about legal strategies, fees, or expectations, but rarely do those disagreements escalate into violence. Yet in this case, investigators believe that a combination of stress, disappointment, and misunderstanding may have pushed the situation beyond control. For Zhang Xiaoning, the possibility of losing her future in the United States may have felt overwhelming. Years of studying and adapting to life in a new country suddenly appeared to be collapsing. For Li Jingjing, the meeting may have been just another difficult conversation with a frustrated client. To people facing the same situation, but seeing it through completely different lenses. And when that tension finally exploded, the consequences were irreversible. As the case moved through the legal system, it continued to attract attention from both the local community and the media. Many people struggled to understand how a young student with no history of violence could commit such a brutal act. Others focused on the intense pressures that surround immigration cases, especially for students and immigrants whose legal status can determine the course of their entire lives. The tragedy also raised uncomfortable questions. Questions about trust between lawyers and clients. Questions about expectations and communication in complicated legal cases. And questions about how desperation can sometimes lead people to make decisions they never imagined themselves capable of making. For the family and colleagues of Li Jingjing, the loss was devastating. A respected professional and member of the community was gone. For Zhang Xiaoling, the future she had once come to the United States hoping to build was now overshadowed by the consequences of a single violent moment. And for the community of Flushing, the case served as a disturbing reminder of how fragile ordinary life can be. A routine meeting, a simple legal consultation, a quiet office on a busy street. All of it seemed normal until it suddenly wasn't. Even today, the story continues to leave people asking the same question. Was this tragedy simply the result of a heated argument that spiraled out of control? Or was it the final breaking point after months of pressure, fear, and desperation? Whatever the answer may be, the events of that day remain a haunting example of how quickly lives can change and how devastating the consequences can be when tension turns into violence. And for many people who followed the case, one thought continues to linger. If that final conversation had gone differently, if the argument had ended another way, perhaps the story of that afternoon in Flushing would have ended very differently. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos.